From the 17th into the early 20th century, women in Istanbul's Ottoman harems lived under seclusion, hierarchy, and strict household control. A runaway woman who reached the street alive could still be seized, legally returned to her owner, and vanish behind doors again. So how did women survive if they actually got out? Usually through some combination of money, family connections, education, marriage, patronage, or work. Freedom by itself did not feed you. And for an enslaved woman, simply running away did not automatically make her free. Ottoman law generally required runaways to be returned to their owners. That's the ugly part. You could cross the gate and still legally belong to the household you had escaped. One of the clearest real examples comes very late in the empire. In 1906, two elite Ottoman sisters known publicly as Zeyneb Hanım and Melek Hanım fled Istanbul for Europe. These were not concubines in the Sultan's Imperial Harem. They were daughters of a powerful Ottoman official, raised in the secluded women's world of an elite household. Their real names were Hatice Zenur and Nuriye Nair el-Nisa, and the names Zeyneb and Melek were pseudonyms used around a famous literary scandal. Their father had given them an unusually Western education. They had European governesses and knew several languages. Then adulthood arrived and, basically, the walls came back. Zeyneb was pushed into an arranged marriage she hated. The sisters became involved with French novelist Pierre Loti and helped feed material into his 1906 novel Les Désenchantés, a book about frustrated Ottoman women. Their identities had to be protected because imperial reprisals were a real concern. Then they left. And this is where the fantasy of escape runs into the boring, brutal question nobody puts in the painting. Okay, you're free. Now what the hell do you eat? At first, the sisters had something most runaway women did not: money from home. Their father publicly disowned them, but he secretly continued sending an allowance. That cash mattered more than all the romantic talk about liberty. It meant rooms, food, train tickets, respectable clothes, and the ability to move through Europe without immediately becoming dependent on some stranger. They traveled through France and Italy and spent time in places including London, Spain, and Brussels. Zeyneb wrote letters describing the strange shock of European life. She had escaped the restrictions of her Ottoman household, but she did not suddenly discover a paradise where women did whatever they wanted. She saw different rules, different hypocrisies, and different kinds of social control. Then, in 1908, their father died. The allowance disappeared. There it is. Freedom gets a lot less poetic when the money stops. Melek had married a Polish aristocrat, which gave her temporary security. But later, the Russian Revolution wiped out the income from his family estates. So she fell back on something incredibly practical: sewing. She had secretly trained with a dressmaker while still in Constantinople, and that hidden skill eventually became a way to earn a living. Not jewels, not a mysterious prince, a needle, fabric, and paid work. Zeyneb took a different path. She never married, continued writing, and eventually returned to Turkey in 1912. That detail matters because it destroys the neat Hollywood ending. She had escaped. She had seen Europe. She had lived outside the old household. And still, freedom abroad was complicated enough that going home became possible. Now, if we move from elite household harems to the Sultan's actual imperial harem, the evidence changes. Successful dramatic escapes from the palace are much harder to document than novels and movies make them seem. Most female palace slaves did not leave by climbing a wall at midnight. The normal route out was manumission. After serving for a period, many were formally freed and left the palace with continued ties to the imperial court. And those ties were survival. The vast majority of manumitted female palace slaves later married, often into the Ottoman military administrative class. Many settled in Istanbul. Their palace training, reputation, contacts, and continuing patronage gave them a social network outside the harem. Some former palace women became quite wealthy, so the empire had created a strange system. First, it enslaved and trained these women inside a closed household. Then it often released them into marriages and patronage networks connected to that same ruling machine. Freedom, sponsored by the people who owned your previous life, but not every former palace woman landed comfortably. In 1791, a former palace slave named Sungur wrote to Sultan Selim III. She said she had been taken into the Imperial palace when she was only 5 years old. She had served 3 sultans and had eventually been manumitted. By the time she appealed for help, she was blind, poor, and had nobody to care for her. Think about that for a second. A child enters the palace at 5. She grows old serving rulers. Eventually she is free. Then age and blindness arrive, and the person she has to beg for survival is the palace, Jesus. Another former Imperial Harem woman, Fatma Usta, shows the same trap from a different angle. By 1799, she was living in Medina with other former palace women. When their state-supported income was reduced during wartime, she protested. She explained that the women had no other source of revenue, that they had already sold jewelry, and that they had spent years serving the dynasty. That is what life after the harem could look like, even for women who left legally. Your body was outside the palace, but your economic life could still be tied to it. For an actual runaway slave, things could be harsher. Ottoman rules provided for fugitive slaves to be captured and returned. Official law did not necessarily prescribe a punishment merely for running away, but that did not make the return safe. Once back inside a private household, the balance of power was obvious. The owner had the money, the servants, the walls. The woman had just demonstrated that she wanted out, and if she managed to stay out, she needed protection fast. That could mean reaching relatives, finding patrons, marrying, getting employment, or proving that she was legally free. Without recognized free status, a runaway could live with the frightening possibility that authorities might recognize another person's ownership claim and return her. There is another grim example from the 19th century. A different Melek Hanım, not Zeyneb's sister, had been married to the powerful Ottoman statesman Kıbrıslı Mehmed Pasha. After scandal, divorce, and years of fighting over property she believed was hers, she eventually fled with 2 of her children to Paris. She did survive, but she survived in impoverished exile, and her 1872 memoir, 30 Years in the Harem, came out of that bitter life abroad. So what kept women alive after escaping an Ottoman harem? Not freedom itself. Money kept them alive. Skills kept them alive. Languages helped. Marriage could help. Friends and patrons helped. A recognizable legal status helped. Sometimes writing helped. Sometimes sewing did. And sometimes the woman who had escaped discovered that the network she was trying to leave was still the only network capable of feeding her. That's the cruel irony. The gate could open, the Bosporus could disappear behind you, even the empire itself could fall behind the horizon, and you could still spend the next morning asking the same terrifying question: where do I go now?